how long does this go on for? Oh, that dopamine. Oh man, that was so good. So it's really cool as a hobbyist indie game developer to see the rise in popularity of games made by really small teams. Recently, for example, there was the massive explosion in popularity of the game Vampire Survivors. So I've been a hobbyist indie game developer for the past 2 years, so I thought it would be cool to kind of go into Vampire Survivors with a sort of fresh perspective and try to pick up on some of the features that make the game so fun and addictive and just so popular. And maybe for all of the other hobbyist indie game developers out there or full-time indie game developers, we can sort of learn to pick up some of the features or things that really make the game popular. This video is sponsored by Brilliant, but more on that later. And wishlist my indie game Castlemancer over on Steam. It really helps me out. Before this video, I've only played Vampire Survivors for about 5 minutes, just to familiarize myself with kind of the controls in the environment. So this is still pretty fresh. I haven't really done much in the game or really explored anything, so I wanted to keep my perspective and reaction to the game like pretty authentic, as if it was the first time. Okay, so I mean, the menu's nothing like huge or anything, but it's kind of charming. I remember, so I watched the No Clip documentary about Vampire Survivors, and the creator actually got a lot of these assets from a Castlevania asset pack. So hence why it's sort of like that pixel art, I don't know, vampire, medieval aesthetic. Okay, so we're just gonna hop in here. I don't have any of these other characters sort of unlocked yet, so that's nice for replayability and whatnot. So we're gonna go with Antonio. Gains 10% more damage every 10 levels. All right, let's see. So one of the first things I noticed is like the jewels falling from the XP level and like the colors changing a lot. I remember from that documentary actually that the developer used to work on casino software, and if you've been to like a casino, the game is really about like a lot of bright colors and hitting a lot of bonuses, because like subconsciously your brain, like you get that little boost of dopamine when you see like a bunch of numbers or a bunch of multipliers. You could recreate this game in Unity, which I think they did. I think the original game was actually made in JavaScript. What they're doing here is they're mixing a top-down view, so like a tile map you see in the background, which you can just walk around and stuff, but also the physics aspect of having gravity. So that's what those axes are, which is pretty interesting. It's kind of an interesting mix, because simulating gravity in a top-down view is actually kind of difficult, at least from what I've done, because I have a similar mechanic in Castlemancer where you're launching spells that are supposed to go in an arc, and to create a imitation of gravity in a top-down view can actually be kind of like jarring to look at. So finding that balance can be a little difficult, because when you're looking at this, like the ground is like directly behind the character, and the axe is falling southwards, which is kind of like a weird perspective when you think about it, versus like in actual gravity it would just fall towards the ground, which in this view is actually behind you. But it turns out it doesn't really matter, because I think as an indie game developer, you think about a lot of these small details, and the details end up to the player not actually mattering them, or maybe you don't notice it as much, versus if you like didn't have that sort of background in developing games, for example. So I noticed there's no actual health bars on other enemies, and that's something I've been debating in my game. So my game has a lot of enemies on screen at one time. Yeah, I don't know, comment below if there were health bars in this, would that be better, because you know which sort of enemies to target before other ones, or is it just more fun to just kind of guess and not really pay attention? If you're watching this and have played a lot of this game, you're probably like crying at like my strategy. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of walking around like trying not to die, and I think that's one of the mechanics that's really interesting in this game, and that I wanted to react to, is that typically in games you usually have like the player action of like clicking around and, you know, determining when and where to attack. That's one of the main player inputs into most games. If you think about something like Call of Duty, where you're shooting, or really any sort of RPG where you're attacking from melee, it's usually the player that's controlling the attacks, rather than you just trying to position yourself for an attack. So it changes the actual player input and the gameplay a lot. So like first impressions of the first run through here is that the game absolutely nails the core gameplay loop. It's very fun. I I think the replayability aspect really comes through with the different characters, as well as the different items and builds that you can do. And honestly, just like trying to figure out like kind of the best strategies. And what's really interesting, again, that I mentioned is sort of like how the game shifts the player input to movement and control rather than trying to like time different attacks. Like imagine all of the abilities that you chose from, you could like bind them to a key, and then it basically becomes something like World of Warcraft where you're just spamming keys with different cooldowns. And that's definitely one form of gameplay, and that's one form of gameplay I really liked. Like I really liked Arena in World of Warcraft, but this is really taking the control away from the player in terms of player input and more moving that control to player positioning and almost strategy at that sense. Like what makes this so just fun? And I think it's a lot of those, like the sounds, like it's almost like the World of Warcraft level up sound, like that just ping. It's just like it makes your like the dopamine in your brain just spike. And I think that's very similar with the level up here and like the flashing and the colors and stuff like that. So I was actually using this game as a reference for how they did enemy collisions. So it's like another one of those things that you don't really notice until you start developing a game. So how does this game actually handle enemy collisions, for example? So can enemies just stack all on top of each other? So if you look at this cloud, for example, that just came out of bats, they actually don't. They get very close to each other, but they still are able to kind of push and walk past. So that means they don't actually push the player. So that means, but they can collide with the player, but they also can't collide, or they do collide with each other, which means that there's only a finite amount of enemies that can ever attack you at once, because eventually your entire radius would be surrounded by enemies, and therefore, since they all collide with each other, they would all kind of sit in the back, or the ones that like can't reach you in the beginning. So there's whatever like the radius of the collider of each of these enemies is, and the max that can fit around you would be sort of the max damage that you could take any given turn. I remember I saw on YouTube, actually, I got recommended. I think it was a very popular video. Like, it was someone like playing Vampire Survivors, but they beat the entire game. Actually, I don't know if you can beat this, but they got to some level without moving. I think in typical or like conventional knowledge, if I told a game designer, hey, I can beat your game without moving the player, is that a compliment or is that sort of an insult? Like, you shouldn't be able to beat the game by just like standing still, but maybe you should be able to. And maybe that's why it's fun to challenge yourself to get to the point where you can. Oh, that animation is so good. Yeah, this is totally like ripped from like a slot machine or something. Like, how long does this go on for? Dude, honestly, like, I feel like this game's kind of hard. It only lasts like 7 minutes in this. Oh, so I actually didn't know this. So does this unlock more items when you do certain things in the game? That's really cool. I actually didn't know that. So that's how they kind of incentivize you to kind of do another run, which I think is honestly a really cool gameplay loop. So that's like, I think that's such a key aspect of this game is like, okay, well now I know what items I've unlocked so far, but I need to get like the next unlock, almost the hamster wheel or the gameplay loop outside of the gameplay loop. Like, there's the core gameplay loop of walking around, timing your attacks, and killing enemies, gaining XP, and then ultimately leveling up and getting new attacks to see if you can survive longer. But then there's like the broader gameplay loop where after that gameplay loop finishes, when the game is over, the other one is you've now gotten this XP, and you can now get further items to go in to do new runs and unlock new characters. So it's like a really strong outer gameplay loop leading into a really strong inner gameplay loop. Oh, okay, so you actually use coins. I was wondering what you used the coins for, because I wasn't super familiar with it. So you can actually choose like a certain build that you want by like buying specific power-ups. They offer you the option to actually like refund them. So I think that's really cool in case you want to try out a different build. Wait, so oh, I didn't realize. I thought every enemy dropped XP. It's also interesting in this game that all of the sprites are left, right. So it's basically when you go right, it's just a mirror of the left, and there's no specific down sprite. Oh, that dopamine. Oh man, that was so good. Oh, does that tree have a collider? I haven't noticed any colliders yet. If you have a lot of like collisions on a map, you don't want them to get stuck. So typically you'll implement some sort of like pathfinding algorithm, like A star is a really common example. The developer basically said that like there was no intelligent AI. I'm guessing they just kind of let the collisions go. And if you are interested in making a game like Vampire Survivors, you might want to learn some foundational computer science, and you can do that with today's sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant is one of the best ways to learn computer science and math topics interactively. Brilliant features thousands of lessons covering a huge range from basic math to advanced AI, data science, and even neural networks. Plus, there are new lessons added monthly. Now, the enemies in Vampire Survivors are not super smart, but if you were interested in creating more advanced enemy AI, you might want to check out Brilliant's neural network and AI courses. That can give you a strong and functional foundation for machine learning. And hey, maybe you can create some hyper-intelligent enemy AI that are super hard to beat. So if you're committed to continuously developing skills as a professional, Brilliant can be a vital tool. Brilliant also has bite-sized courses that are designed for busy people, including all you part-time game devs. Brilliant's interactive nature makes it much more effective in learning and building analytical skills. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free, for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/biteofmichael or click on the link in the description below. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thank you to Brilliant for supporting the channel. All right, so we did, I think, like 4 or 5-ish runs. I think I got a good grasp on it, and ultimately it's a great game. And I think I called out a lot of the immediate like design choices or game development choices that I noticed, at least from my like 2 years of indie game development experience. So things like the collisions and things like, you know, the just like the kind of the simple enemy movements, the lack of health bars, the kind of the little details that go into like satisfying sounds. So like satisfying sounds, or like the loot chest open animation, for example, is another really good one. Or when you level up, you get that like rain of like colorful jewels and stuff like that. And I think that's similar to something like somebody at Apple mentioned this, is like the little movements on like the iPhone are what they measure a lot. The really key details that someone doesn't consciously think about, but you subconsciously notice. And I think Vampire Survivors does that so well, where there are probably some other games that are maybe, you know, in the classical sense of the word, more polished, or, you know, with like smoother animations, or like more, or just better graphics. I mean, I like these graphics, but you know, but they don't nail those like little minor details of getting a treasure drop, or actually leveling up, or hitting the enemies, or finding that like fire breath special item that just damages all of the enemies at once, and you see all those like red numbers pop up. And I think Vampire Survivors, from a game development and design side, absolutely nails those. So I think going through this playthrough, this is obviously the longest time that I've played this game for. So I took a lot of good points away that I think I'll take to My Game Castlemancer. Again, you should wishlist My Game Castlemancer over on Steam. It really helps me out. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this sort of format, this sort of like live consciousness, me kind of just speaking to, like reacting to this specific type of like indie game and saying what I've like picked up on as, you know, from my experience in indie game development, let me know. We can do more of these. Consider subscribing if you like game development and computer science. We do a bad British accent at the end of every video. Thank you so much, and hopefully I see you in another one. Bye-bye.